I'll be moderating today's Q&A at the end, and we'll introduce the speakers. Our first speaker is Lisa Kampf. She is CRWA's aquatic scientist and was hired after serving as a Rita Barron Fellow from June 2018 to February 2019. As a fellow, she coordinated CRWA's voluntary monthly monitoring program and provided support to our field science programs. As the aquatic scientist, Lisa works as a project coordinator for CRWA's field science programs, such as volunteer monthly monitoring, flagging, and canoeing for clean water. Lisa has a BS in geology from UMass Amherst and is finishing up her MS in geology from Boston College, where she does research on the Yellow River Delta in China. She has previously worked at Mass Audubon and other nonprofit organizations in the state, teaching kids and adults about Massachusetts' natural history. Lisa loves combining her passions for science, education, and advocacy to engage citizens with the natural world around them. Our second speaker, Sarah Grady, is the South Shore Regional Coordinator for the Massachusetts Bay's National Estuary Program and the Watershed Ecologist at the North and South Rivers Watershed Association in Norwell, Mass. She received her Bachelor's of Science in Aquatic Biology from Brown University in 2001 and her PhD in Biology from Boston University Marine Program in Woods Hole in 2006. Her specialties include coastal and estuarine ecology and ecological restoration. And with that, I will hand it over to Lisa Kampf to get us started.
Thank you, Pallavi. I'm very excited to talk with you guys today about the Charles River and the past, present, and future of dams on the Charles. So just a quick overview of our agenda for the evening. I'll be talking a little bit about the history of dams on the Charles, why and how we might want to do dam removal, and then give you an insight to 3 of the restoration projects that we have going on in the watershed right now. And then I'll hand it over to Sarah, who will talk a little bit more about dam removals that have happened on the South Shore, how they happen, and then we'll look at a case study from 3rd Herring Brook. And then we'll have a question and answer session. And just as a reminder, everybody can put their questions and answers into the Q&A box, and we will read them out to the panelists at the end. So Charles River Watershed Association was founded in 1965 after a concern of poor and worsening water quality. We are one of the oldest watershed associations in the world, or sorry, in the country, not the world. And we work closely with federal, state, and municipal partners. We have a very interdisciplinary staff and several different program areas that range from river science and river water quality monitoring to the Blue Cities Initiative, which focuses on implementing green infrastructure into the urban parts of our watershed, climate change adaptation, which you will learn that dam removal is part of, and then the law, advocacy, and policy tools that support all of these initiatives. So let's talk about dams. Dams are everywhere in the United States. There's over 2 million dams. And I have this short video that just shows how many dams were built between 1800 and 2003. So you can see they're super widely spread, but they are even more highly concentrated in the Northeast area. Many of these dams were built for hydropower and used for industries, some of which no longer exist. Some dams were built for flood control purposes, and about 75 to 90% of the dams in the US no longer serve a functional purpose and are really just relics. So Massachusetts is no exception to this. There are an estimated 3,000 dams in Massachusetts. Many are in poor condition, and many are relics of small old mill dams and on the river tributaries and main stems. You can see from this graphic how they cover the whole state, And this circle is showing the approximate area of the Charles River watershed, which you can see covers 35 cities and towns in Massachusetts, flows 80 miles from Hopkinton to Boston and Cambridge, and has a total area of about 308 square miles. So there are over 100 dams just in the Charles River watershed, and they are owned and maintained by different entities. About 38% are privately owned, 36% are owned by the municipalities, and about 26% are owned by the state. There are currently 19 dams on the main stem of the river. And many of these dams are potential hazards. About 28% are listed as significant hazard dams. And that classification is from the Office of Dam Safety in the Department of Conservation and Recreation in Massachusetts. And that hazard rating is based on the potential for failure. And something to know about this is that any dams classified as significant or high hazard, the owner is required to develop an emergency action plan in case of breach. So on the Charles River, dams began to be built on the main stem starting in the 1600s. The Watertown Dam, which used to be called Grist Mill Dam, was the first to be built in 1634. And more dams continued to be built between the 1700s and the 1800s as industry expanded and the population around the river grew. Another main source of dam building was the mill industry. One main facet on the Charles is the Moody Street Dam in Waltham. And this was built in 1814 to power a paper mill, which later got converted into a cotton mill. Dams were continued to be built into the late 1900s, and one of the major ones that changed the river system was the Charles River Dam, which was built in 1908, which is the current site of the Museum of Science. This dam was significant because it effectively stopped all tidal flow into the Charles River and really isolated it from the Boston Harbor. The incentive to build the Charles River Dam was mainly due to the smell that sewage and trash caused when it washed up on the tidal flats. And this was completed only about 30 years after most of the Back Bay area was filled for the same reason. A need for more flood control and more robust locks spurred the building of the new Charles River Dam, which is just downstream of the old one, and that was completed in 1978. That dam is now regulated for flood control and controls the level of the lower basin of the Charles River. And it does have a fish ladder as well and is maintained by the Department of Conservation and Recreation. So we know that all of these dams are here, but the question is, are they affecting the river? Well, let's look here at an example. So say this is your typical river looking at a profile where the blue is the water surface and the brown is the bed of the river. So when a dam gets built, the first thing to happen is that the water behind it gets impounded and you form a bit of a lake. Next, there's erosion that happens downstream of the dam because there's a lack of sediment that is coming from upstream. This also, you are effectively blocking the fish passage unless a fish ladder is installed in the dam or some other system is put in place. So that limits the amount of migration from seasonally migrating fish. Sediment then settles in the impoundment over time, and nutrients that are coming down from the river accumulate in that water and in the sediment. Because this sediment is, or because this water behind the dam is still, it warms in many cases and evaporates, which lowers the water level and limits the amount of aquatic habitat space as well. You can also get a lot of plant growth, especially invasive plant growth in these backwater impoundments, because you have an excess amount of nutrients, high water temperatures, and sometimes lower water levels. When this happens, the oxygen in the water column gets depleted, which can cause aquatic life death. So in general, the dams are limiting the amount of aquatic habitat space, and they are degrading water quality. Well, so now we are at a point in the Charles River that we know that the watershed has been greatly impacted and altered, but we may ask, what should we do next? Is it better to leave the dams in, or is it better to remove them? We know that this degraded the habitat in the past, but didn't the ecosystem just adjust to these dams? And will removing it fix anything? Well, we've seen from neighboring communities that the benefits of dam removal are very real. Dam removal can restore natural riverine habitat, restore the natural floodplain by decreasing the size of those impoundments behind the dam, restore habitat connectivity for migrating fish and other animals. And then it also has benefits for recreation and reduces the hazards that we talked about before. So as an example, I was just gonna show this quick video, which is very nice, from the removal of the Millie Turner Dam in Pepperell.
Secondly, I think the state was able to give enough information to help people who was supposed to go to the river. Swine instances are so important to the health of the national, good quality water and cool. I mean, one day it was unbelievably bad, different colors. I mean, lavenders. Oh, it's horrible. I always feel nothing is so good that it can't be better. So the job is never done. It was really exciting for me to see that this dam come down, knowing that the streams were being restored and they were going back to what they'd been before. That was what was really amazing, how quickly things can change and change for the better. And then to hear that right away the trout came back. People sort of used to it and are comfortable with what they know, but coming down and being built on the bedrock, you still have that sort of picturesque where the water tumbles, and people appreciate that. I think they will get used to having the river grow back in its natural state. I think they'll enjoy it just as much. You know, things being able to come back after having been practically completely destroyed. Excited too that there were so many people at both occasions celebrate dams being removed, and real sense of excitement and enthusiasm for what was happening. Now that the dam's down, the watershed has expanded because now the Ness empties into the Nashua. And north of here is a brook trout stream that's managed for brook trout, and it feeds the Nashua, so I think the future's bright. It's a beautiful place to spend the time. And the trout, it's like sharks, are just tearing them up. Oh my God, I can't get it. Oh,
Another reason to opt for dam removal at this point in time rather than in the future or in the past is that climate change is really providing a good incentive to remove these dams now. What we're seeing in the Northeast is a significant increase in the volume of rainfall that's occurring each year and the intensity of that rainfall. You can see from this graphic that there's been a 71% increase in the observed rainfall, and you can see it has risen significantly in the Northeast area. Aging dams are very vulnerable to breaches during these storms, whether it's from roots that have gotten into the base of the dam that can then, when the tree falls over, can break the dam, or trees falling onto the spillway of a dam. They are very vulnerable. Another thing that makes them more vulnerable from when they were built is that there has been a lot of more urban development surrounding the river and the dams that exist there since they were built, which increases the vulnerability. Other reasons to remove dams is that the cost of maintaining these dams is high, and as we saw before, many dams are owned by municipalities, and that is a recurring cost that taxpayers have taken the burden of in the past. There is also a lot of funding right now out there for dam removal and less funding for dam repair, but more and more funding sources are requiring that dam owners look at the potential for breach or for removal before just going ahead and repairing any broken dams. And then the major approach that we've seen by Massachusetts is to start with what is most hazardous. So starting with that list of the significant hazard dams and going from there. So when you do restore a river, there are many different ways that you can take on that restoration. One way is complete dam removal, which we saw in the previous video. Another option is breaching parts of the dam or even notching the dam. This is a great photo from the Bleachery Dam, which is on the main stem of the Charles River in Waltham. It was notched in 2005 and now provides more connectivity and some ecosystem benefits because of that notching. The design of a dam removal or breach can incorporate some values of the community. So often dams are very important historical places that the community has. And so sometimes the sound of the river going over the dam is very important. And the amount of vegetation around there is very important. And so things like that can be incorporated into a new restored area so that those values are upheld. So dam removal is not new on the Charles River or in the watershed. many dams have been removed or modified. This is a list of some of them. Some of these dams were breached historically with storms and were never repaired. That's kind of how most dams in the watershed have been removed in the past. One example of a full dam removal on the main stem of the river was the Old Mill Dam in Bellingham, which was removed in 2016. And here you can see pictures of the dam before its removal, after its removal in December 2016, and then how the floodplain rebounded the next summer in this picture from August 2017. This dam was owned by the town of Bellingham, and CRWA partnered with the town to help advocate for this dam removal. You can see that we started that advocacy back in 2008, and it wasn't removed till 2016, showing how long dam removal processes can take, but that's very necessary for all of the community engagement that is needed. So now I'm going to talk about a few future restoration projects. One of those that CRWA is working on right now is on Eagle Dam, which is in Rentham. Here you can see a map of it. It's located in the upper watershed, is just downstream of Lake Pearl, which is impounded by another dam called Red Dam. But the impoundment from Eagle Dam is pretty small, and it is right upstream of Route 140. So this dam was built in the 1800s as a mill dam. The mill was subsequently removed, and the dam is in failing condition. It has breached in the past, and those breaches have caused flooding in downstream communities such as Norfolk, and has taken out some critical infrastructure like transportation. And that flooding also is a hazard for Route 140, especially because of how close the dam is to Route 140. This dam was identified as a risk in the town's climate action planning process. And so since 2019, CRWA has partnered with the town to assess the removal of this dam rather than another repair. One of the hopes of this project was that a removal may allow space in where the impoundment used to be for access to Lake Pearl. That is kind of yet to be determined, but is a hope of this project. Right now, we are working to engage with the abutters on the impoundment, but we found from an initial feasibility study that additional hydraulic modeling is needed, and more robust stakeholder engagement is needed. So the groups that we need to bring together and talk with are MassDOT, who maintains Route 140, which is just downstream, the town taxpayers who are currently paying for the dam, and then downstream communities like Norfolk that can be affected if a failure was to happen. Another project that CRWA is working on is the Watertown Dam. So CRWA first got involved with the Watertown Dam doing fish monitoring in 2012. Previously, we had been involved with the Division of Marine Fisheries to stock the Charles River with American shad. And so we also partnered with them later to monitor the progress that those shad were making and how often they were coming back to the river during migration season. So as part of this monitoring, we discovered that the fish ladder at the Watertown Dam was not big enough to pass the American shad, especially the females that are a little bit larger. Most of those females were stuck downstream of the dam, and many were predated by birds that were in the area. So this was a problem, but we also looked at some other factors with this dam. It is listed as a significant hazard dam, especially due to the surrounding population density. If this dam were to fail, then it would flood downstream communities and houses. There's also it's been studied that there's some tree root infringement that is in the spillway of the dam, and this would require repair and unfortunately removal of the viewing platform that is a community icon. And so something has to happen anyways. And this dam was never used for flood control. It's again, just a relic mill dam. So we worked to get this dam put on the Division of Ecological Restoration's priority project list, and it was listed there in 2016. It is owned by the Department of Conservation and Recreation, so we've worked with DER and DCR over the past several years to complete a feasibility assessment, which is almost done. It should be done in the next year or so. And the next steps of this project are community engagement and a kind of a visioning process around what restoration in this location would look like. Likely in this location, the restoration would incorporate this. This is an area of a natural change in elevation. It was actually where the head of the tide used to be before the dam was here. And so it would probably incorporate like a rocky riffle area where you would be able to hear the flowing of the water. The third project that is fairly new is the South Natick Dam. So here's a great historical photo of the South Natick Dam. And then on the right, you can see this is a drone photo of the dam looking downstream, and the impoundment is closest to you. So this dam has both a spillway and an earthen part of the dam, which is where all of these trees are here. Because the Office of Dam Safety requires that no tree roots can be growing inside of a dam because of the potential problems with that, and in a storm, the town had planned to take those trees out and repair the earthen part of the dam without the tree roots in it. This process went through some stakeholder engagement, and at one of the town meetings, someone brought up, well, have you explored the possibility of taking out the dam rather than getting rid of all of the trees on the dam? And the town had not considered that previously, but since then, they are now considering that, and they are now starting a feasibility study around this dam removal. So in conclusion, removing dams is one way to restore the Charles River and its watershed, and is also an important way that we can be adapting to climate change. So thank you so much for your attention, and stay in contact with us through all of these means.
So hello everybody, I am Sarah Grady, and I am the South Shore Regional Coordinator for the Massachusetts Bays National Estuary Program, and also the Watershed Ecologist for the North and South Rivers Watershed Association. So Mass Bays is one of 28 national estuary programs that are scattered around the country. And the national estuary programs are part of the EPA. There are 2 programs in Massachusetts, our program and the Buzzards Bay program. And the way we're structured is that we have 5 regional coordinators along the Massachusetts coast from the New Hampshire border around to Provincetown. I am in the pink region, south of Boston, and you are in the yellow region, which is our Metro Boston region. And your regional coordinator is Tori Hanley, who is at Northeastern University. NSRWA is another watershed association. We are in Norwell, Massachusetts. And we are our motto is to inspire a community of stewards dedicated to a healthy and vibrant watershed. We really have three big problems that we've identified as our priorities: stormwater pollution, water withdrawals, and dams. And so I'm going to be talking to you today about that third one and giving you some examples of how we've approached dam removal within our watershed as well as throughout the South Shore. So just to kind of recap some of the impacts of dams and the things that get sort of fixed when you do a dam removal. Upstream from a dam, you are able to convert the habitat from being a lake-like or pond-like habitat to being a riverine habitat. And you end up revegetating a wetland, restoring community structure, and there's a channel as well as a natural floodplain that's able to evolve. You're reconnecting that river along its corridor, which allows fish that are downstream to move upstream. There's also positive impacts downstream of where that dam was. All that sediment that's built up behind the dam gets to move downstream and start to redeposit. What we often see in our dam sites are that the downstream areas are very rocky. They've been sediment starved. And once we are able to remove a dam, the sediments, the natural sediments that would be in those places are able to migrate downstream. And in coastal rivers, that's very important because once you get past the head of tide, you're getting into places like salt marshes where sediment deprivation is a significant problem. So I'm going to talk a little about dam removal in Massachusetts and why Massachusetts has seen such an acceleration in dam removal lately. And there's really four things that have led to that. First of all, we have pretty strong dam safety laws that were updated relatively recently. And so when you are a dam owner, you're required to have that dam inspected. And as Lisa mentioned, the dams are rated according to their hazard. So there's some incentive from that perspective to remediate the hazard situation of your dam. There's also a lot of great guidance from Massachusetts on how dam removal affects things like the Wetlands Protection Act. Prior to some of this guidance coming out, it was harder to permit dam removal projects in the state because many of the local conservation commissions weren't quite sure what dam removal meant for the Protection Act. So now with this guidance, they're able to understand a little bit better and have something to fall back upon when there are questions about how dam removal affects wetlands. Of course, in our state, we have a lot of strong leaders and advocates at the state level in the form of the Division of Ecological Restoration, as well as organizations like ours and yours, who are advocating for these projects to happen and really pushing them forward by seeking funding and bringing together partners and making sure that each of the steps progresses the way that it is supposed to. And finally, there's a lot of great support and funding that comes in at the federal level, especially from NOAA, from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as at the state level from the Division of Ecological Restoration, often the Massachusetts Environmental Trust, and then also other nonprofits too. We've received some funding on our project from groups like Trout Unlimited, for example. So those four things together have really helped dam removal become much easier in Massachusetts than it was about 2 decades ago. So on the South Shore, we've been progressing with dam removals throughout the South Coastal Watershed. So we've been able to see 24 dams removed since 2002, which has opened up about 12% of the habitat there. 13 dams remain that have fish passage, but still disconnect habitat and overall stream continuity, and that's about 20% of that habitat. Right now we have about 7 dams that are under consideration, plus 1 fish passage project. And the next project that is on the docket for the region, but also for me in particular, is the removal of the Peterson Pond Dam, which is on the Third Herring Brook in Norwell. It's on the Norwell-Hanover border. It forms the border between the 2 towns. And so I'm going to talk about the progress that we've made on the Third Herring Brook, because that is where a lot of our the dam removals that I've been working on directly have been happening. So this is a map of the Third Herring Brook, and you can see sort of on the locus map, it is an inland tributary that flows to the North River, which is a tidal estuary. And it had 4 dams on it initially. So we had the Tack Factory Dam, as you're moving upstream, the Tack Factory Dam, the Mill Pond Dam, the Peterson Pond Dam, which is the one that I just mentioned, and then the Jacobs Pond Dam. So the first dam that was able to be removed was the Mill Pond Dam, and that was removed in 2014. It breached during a storm in 2010. And prior to that, it had just kind of gone up and down in water level. After it breached, it destabilized the dam structure itself, but also became a greater hazard to the dam owner, who is the South Shore YMCA. And so that initiated the process of trying to remove that dam. And so that dam was the first one out, but it was not the first one from the estuary. It's the second one up. So Lisa was mentioning that in a lot of cases, you know, you would like to attack these projects in order of hazard, but often as much of it is about opportunity. Opportunity both in these sort of random things that happen, like a dam breach, but also opportunity as far as bringing together partners and funding. Sometimes a project comes to fruition because of who's involved. So our second dam removal on the Third Herring Brook was the Tack Factory Dam, and that was removed in 2017. The first dam from the North River, and as you'll see a little bit later, this one was a long time in coming. So this was a big, big win for us at the Watershed Association. You can see before it was taken out, it was you know, one of these crumbling stone dams. And then afterward, we were able, that's immediately afterward, we had a free-flowing stream. So the main thing to remember about dam removal projects is that they are phased and they take time. So it's not like a group decides they're just gonna go out and blow up a dam or something like that. There's a lot of time that goes into it. Typically, the project starts with feasibility and preliminary design. And each of these phases often requires its own batch of funding. So in between each of these phases, there are people trying to apply for grants, trying to pull together each of these phases. So there's feasibility and preliminary design, which typically takes about a year, involves things like sediment testing, wetland delineation, hydrology and hydraulics modeling, gathering all that information that you would want to know before getting into a project. So that helps shape how much the rest of the project is going to cost for the most part, because if you have a dam that has clean sediment behind it, you'll probably be able to do downstream release. If there's, say, crazy contamination behind the dam, then you might have to look at, you know, things like dredging. So it's really gathering all your facts before you get into the nitty-gritty of the project. It also feeds into the next phase, which is permitting. So permitting can take anywhere between 1 to 2 years. I would say probably closer to 2. And there are a lot of different types of permits that you have to do a dam removal. You have to get local permits from your local conservation commission. So that comes often in the notice of intent. So for our dam removals on the Third Herring Brook, we had to go talk to Hanover and Norwell. At the state level, you have to file with the Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act, MEPA. You have to have a water quality certification, and you have to, where we have tidelands and things like that, we have to have Chapter 91, which affects the sediment permitting. There's also federal permitting. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has what's called a 404 permit, and you have to make sure that the project is federally consistent with historical concerns. So that's the Section 106 consistency, and usually that's overseen by a federal agency, usually whichever federal agency is contributing the most funding to the project. Then we get into final design. So that's really hammering out those details, you know, where is the breach going to be? How large is it going to be? What's the channel going to look like? What's the approach to the project going to look like? And, you know, you're working with engineers throughout this process to do that kind of work. So that can take 6 months to a year to complete. And then the big exciting part is, you know, pretty quick. Construction typically takes, you know, at most 2 months. If you've if you watch a dam removal, it's surprising how quickly it can happen. So, you know, if you think about planning a dam removal, you can kind of think about it like planning a big party or a wedding, in a sense, where you spend a whole lot of time ahead of time doing all of these different things, but then the actual event is pretty quick. So, and then you get to celebrate too, which is, which is exciting. So a little bit more detail about those 2 dam removals. Let's start with the Mill Pond Dam. So in the timeline, this project actually made it to permitting in 2003, but it stalled locally. And that was because it was before there was any good advice for local conservation commissions. This was really at the very forefront of dam removal in Massachusetts. And there just wasn't enough understanding, you know, which brings forth the importance of outreach on these kinds of projects, and really making sure that, you know, local officials understand what's happening, and that, you know, the citizens understand what's happening too. Because really those are the people who are going to be helping you get this project through, in a sense. These days, it's not too common for a project to stall locally anymore, because that understanding is there. So the dam breached in a storm in 2010, as I mentioned. We were able to complete feasibility in 2012. It was permitted in 2013. Some of that was quicker because of the previous work that had been done. And then final design was completed in 2014, and it was removed at the very end of 2014. In our case, you know, a lot of these dam removals have to be timed for low water, but also for certain times of year due to time of year restrictions for migrating anadromous fish. So things like river herring, you can't, and smelt too. So we pretty much have to be done with dam removals by March, and you can't really start them up you can't have them going on sort of in the early fall either, so which is the lowest water. The owner of this dam is the South Shore YMCA. It received funding from Mass DER, the Fish and Wildlife Service, a local foundation, Corporate Wetland Restoration Partnership, and the USDA. The total project cost is a little bit of a mystery because the YMCA kicked in a lot of money. And they kind of managed a lot of the costs themselves. But it was roughly about a $300,000 project, all told. And so this is what it looks like now. I know it doesn't even look like there's water there, but on the left-hand side, if you kind of can see sort of a log or piece of wood in the middle of the picture, and the stream is flowing past there. You can see where there's some wetland plants. And it just flows down through that wetland and around that corner. And then the other picture on the right is looking upstream toward the former impoundment, so where that pond used to be, and it's completely revegetated. And then where you see those cattails off in the distance, that's where the stream channel is. What was interesting about this project is that there had been some concern about invasion of purple loosestrife, which is an invasive species. When the dam was removed, there was some sort of on the edges. And so contingent to the project and the permit for the project, we were required to do some vegetation monitoring. So I led a project to monitor what was growing there. And I also did a release of these particular beetles that eat purple loosestrife as a way of biocontrolling that purple loosestrife. So you can just kind of see the beetles there. This is not always typical, but every dam removal does have pre and post monitoring. So that's another thing. You know, the projects don't just happen and then get abandoned. They're often monitored for up from 3 to 5 years after they've been taken out to make sure that everything is progressing the way it should. So the second dam removal, time-wise, is the Tack Factory Dam. And again, this one started early too. And it had been a project starting in 2003, and it just never really got going with funding and support until a little bit later. We completed feasibility in 2013, got permits in hand in 2015, final design 2016, and then it was removed through the winter, 2016 into 2017. It was owned by a local nonprofit, Cardinal Cushing Centers, which runs a school for disabled students. So this was certainly not in their mission, but they were great partners to work with. And we had a lot of other project partners at the federal and state level, as well as other nonprofits helping out. And the cost of this project was about $365,000. and most of that was in construction, as it often is. So down below the lower picture, that is what it looked like immediately after the project happened. So immediately after the dam was removed and that channel was cleared. And of course it was winter, so there's not much growing on that previous bottom of the impoundment. But this is what the stream channel looks like now. So this is looking downstream at the dam removal site. So if you had been here while the dam was still there, the dam would be right in front of your face right now. And this is, I mean, it's absolutely a gorgeous, gorgeous spot. And in some parts of the stream, it almost reminds me of New Hampshire, because the grade of the stream is pretty high. So it has rocks and the water tumbles over it. It's just a really fantastic habitat now. Because this is the first dam from the ocean, we monitor river herring, and fortunately we've been monitoring them downstream in the Third Herring Brook since 2012. And the numbers of herring have always kind of bounced around, you know, 2,000, maybe 2,500. And then, so we removed the dam, and the first year we saw 3 herring. The second year we saw 6. And then last year we saw 206 for a population estimate of about 3,000-ish. So, you know, we're seeing fish pass the site. So that's the first time that herring have been past that place in, you know, hundreds of years, which is pretty amazing. The other thing that we did was work with the Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, as well as Trout Unlimited and the Sea Run Brook Trout Coalition, to electrofish and tag trout in the stream, because in addition to the Tack Factory Dam removal, opening up about 2 miles of Mainstem, it opened up about another 6 miles of tributary that was Coldwater tributary, and had isolated pockets of eastern brook trout in it. And as you may recall, one of the impacts of dams is that they heat up the water. So even though there wasn't necessarily a physical restriction to these trout exchanging between their populations, there was a thermal limit to where the trout could go. So they would get down toward the Mainstem, and the Mainstem was too hot. So these fish were tagged, and then we set up antennas at those 2 dam removal sites. So there's, again, the Mill Pond site and the Tack Factory site. And we were able to detect a bunch of fish. So these are all the species that were living in Third Herring Brook when we went electrofishing. And some of those are, you know, sort of pond species that were still hanging out in the brook. But others, things like, you know, we had American eel, we had the different kinds of trout. So that was very exciting. We often get a lot of pickerel, which is exciting too. But the most exciting thing is that we had the first Mainstem trout. And it was caught by one of our friends from Trout Unlimited. And, you know, we caught it, said hello, and put it put it back. But having trout in the Mainstem meant that the Third Herring Brook could be certified as a Coldwater Fisheries resource, which you have to have cold water fish to be a Coldwater Fisheries resource. And that meant that the stormwater regulations for the brook were stricter. And it so happens that the Hanover Mall, which is a lot of pavement, is going to be renovated over the next few years. They're also the owner of the Peterson Pond Dam, which is kind of an interesting relationship because we're working on that dam removal with them. But as they were going through permitting for their new mall project, they were held to a higher standard for stormwater. They're required to infiltrate their stormwater to a higher degree because there were trout in the Third Harry Brook because of our dam removal. So it's like this great chain of the dam removal leading to monitoring and collecting scientific data, and then there being some sort of regulatory impact, a form of management that results in protection of that resource. And it all started back with that dam removal and trying to restore that fish population, which is just kind of a great story to tell. And you know, we love telling that story. So our next adventure is going to be taking out the Peterson Pond Dam, owned by the Hanover Mall. It is, we completed feasibility a couple years ago and completed permitting last year. Right now, we are waiting to hear from NOAA about the last little piece of funding for final design and construction. And we're thinking that the cost of the project is going to be about $380,000 when it's done. It may come in under that. We've been pleasantly surprised by our previous project because the bids have come in lower than expected for construction. So we'll see how that all pans out. And then after that, our last thing is going to be providing fish passage at Jacobs Pond. Jacobs Pond, the dam at Jacobs Pond is actually a relatively major road between Norwell and Hanover. It's Route 123. And Jacobs Pond is, it's owned by the town of Norwell. And the pond is about 62 acres of habitat that would be great for alewife spawning. It's used for a lot of recreation. The South Shore Natural Science Center is next to it. So there are reasons why, in this case, we've chosen to go more in the direction of fish passage versus removal. The other cool thing about it is that we'll be able to establish a herring viewing platform, which will allow us to conduct fish counts up here and also provide a great opportunity for outreach about the entire project. So that's going to be the next thing to tackle as well. So other projects we have coming up, we have a fish passage project at a town water supply on the First Charing Brook. So that's, again, another dam that can't come out because it's providing water supply. It's very minimal, though, the number of dams, as Lisa mentioned, the number of dams that provide some sort of purpose anymore. You know, there aren't a lot of hydro dams. There aren't a lot of water supply dams. Most of them are mill dams that are doing nothing except sitting there and impounding water. We're looking to take out a dam on the South River at Veterans Memorial Park. We're looking to, well, the town of Plymouth is going to be putting a nature lake fishway in place at the Jenny Grist Mill on Town Brook, which has been one of the most impressive dam removal system of dam removal projects in possibly the state, certainly in the South Shore. There's been about 6 dam removals, and they're right in downtown Plymouth. And if you also can't get more historic than downtown Plymouth. So for those who have been concerned about how things like something being a historic structure or, you know, those kinds of concerns it's not something that causes the project not to happen. It's just a point of interest to be considered during the process of permitting. And then there's another pretty sizable dam on the Indian Head River that we're looking to remove as well. And I just want to note that dam removal is not the only kind of restoration project that we're working on the South Shore. That we have salt marsh restoration projects. We're looking at culvert inventories and culvert replacements. And there's a lot of cranberry bog restoration that happens too. That's a big surge in cranberry bog restoration in our region. Thank you. This little guy or girl was hanging out by our Tack Factory antenna. So good note to end on.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. So I see there are a few questions, and I can sort of work our way through this. The first one is asking, what about naturally formed dams by tree fall or creature built? Are they just as damaging and also in need of removal? Do you want to take that, Sarah?
Sure. So there's a difference between dams that are created when, say, a beaver builds a dam or a tree falls down and traps some sort of vegetation. And that's because those structures, if you want to call them that, are often permeable to the flow of water. And often the different things like fish can often get through them. And they're also not permanent. So a beaver dam or even just like a tree being down will often get flushed away in a storm. And that allows those river processes to happen again. Also, in a stream that has fish moving back and forth, having some sort of wood in a stream actually is really beneficial to fish like trout, which need to have places to hide, and also their food hides under those pieces of wood too. As far as river herring are concerned, often in some of these coastal streams that have herring wardens or herring commissions, people will walk the stream and very selectively and carefully make sure that there is a path for those fish to travel. But for the most part, it is not a big issue.
Thank you. Lisa, this one's for you. You mentioned notching in one of the projects. What exactly is involved with that?
I mentioned notching when I was talking about the Bleachery Dam in Waltham, which is on the main stem of the Charles. So it's just a technique that allows for basically a little bit of a breach. So depending on how the dam is constructed, in the case of the Bleachery Dam, it's pretty much, a concrete spillway that was easy to basically go out and take some blocks of concrete out along that spillway to allow the flow to go more naturally over. So it's just a technique for breaching the dam.
Great, thank you. The next question is saying, for property owners who lose property to dam removal, is there compensation? And if yes, who pays for that? I'm not sure which one, if you want to take that.
Well, I guess I'm not really understanding how one loses property to dam removal. But as far as I'm concerned, nobody really gets compensated for loss or gain of property due to dam removal because it really doesn't affect property lines at all.
Great. And then the next question is really looking to find out if you're working with local tribes and other representatives on of traditional communities on dam removal? Sarah, this might be for you because I know we haven't done that.
Okay,
I can
sure.
just mention, at least before Sarah jumps in with a more robust answer, that we, as part of some of the feasibility processes, at the very start of this, we do look at the history of the dam and any native sites that may be around the dam or may be exposed because of removing the dam. And so that is definitely something that is considered as to working with Indigenous groups. We don't have experience with that, but Sarah, if you do, that's great.
Yeah, so it's part of the permitting process, as Lisa mentioned. And so consultation with the tribes is often included, and they have the opportunity to comment on the project. When the project happens, if it is in an area that has some historical sensitivity to tribal property or potentially has been found to have some sort of potential for artifacts, there will often be a representative available at the site to be part of the archaeological efforts. There's almost always an archaeologist on site when these dam removal projects are happening. As far as other things, we have been including representatives from, for example, the Wampanoags on projects where there is some sensitivity, in particular in Plymouth. I know, at least for the most recent dam removal, the Holmes dam removal, there were local tribal representatives present at the celebration. They were given the opportunity to, we released tagged herring. And so I was there with Charlie Baker and with representatives from the tribe, and we released those tagged herring together into the newly restored town brook. So there's definitely inclusion, but there's also a lot more work that needs to be done on that inclusion as well. And we've been sort of, as a region, we have something called the Watershed Action Alliance, and we've been trying to work more closely with the local tribes on not just dam removal, but all of the water issues that are going on in the region.
Great. The next question asks, who sets the stormwater quality standards for the coldwater fish? Since you mentioned the change in status had a higher standard for stormwater, I guess this attendee is asking, is that the state or?
Yes, yeah, it's the state. So once it's certified as a coldwater fisheries resource, then that affects the permitting, the DEP permitting at the local level for stormwater.
Great. So that's all we have for questions. I actually had a question listening to you talk about these three examples. In your experience so far, for projects where you've had opposition to dam removal, what has been mostly the cause for that? And then the second part of the question is, you know, how have you sort of worked through that kind of situation to kind of get people to go along with the project moving forward?
Well, you know, it takes time and outreach, I would say. The biggest opposition that I have heard in the various projects kind of comes in two different forms. One is that people are often very attached to the pond itself, but that attachment is not, it's grounded in sort of a fantasy of the past. There's a lot of rosy memories of things happening involving the pond that maybe are not things that are happening anymore. You know, like what for Tack Factory, everyone seemed to remember drinking hot chocolate and playing hockey, you know, on the pond. And I will tell you, we found a lot of hockey pucks. We did when the dam was removed. So, I mean, there's some truth to that. But, and then the other form of opposition is often kind of a misconception of what happens behind the dam after the dam is removed, that it's going to be a terrible mud pit, is often the phrase that we hear. And that's just a matter of pointing out that, you know, these places, these former impoundments green up so fast, and there's such a huge native seed bank that it does not stay this quote unquote mud pit for very long. So a lot of the opposition, it's just time and, you know, showing the benefits of the project. And I mean, in the end, it's up to the dam owner. You know, so even if a watershed association like wants more than anything for a dam to be removed, in the end, it's really the dam owner that is making that decision. You can spend a decade trying to convince them, you know, but that's what we're here for, I guess.
We have a couple more questions. The first one is saying, have changes in precipitation patterns either accelerated or delayed projects?
Can I, or I guess?
Yeah.
No, go ahead, Lisa, you answer one.
I think, is this referring to, I guess more of a clarifying question, is this referring to changes in precipitation patterns over like decades, or is it referring to like if there is a particularly rainy season when you had planned to do your dam removal? I think those are two separate questions. I would say in general, if it's due to you know, the increase in precipitation that we're seeing in the Northeast, then I would say that that is providing an extra incentive to get a lot of these dam removal projects going a little bit faster, and people are seeing the potential hazardous effects of not removing the dams or doing something with them. And then if it's the case of like a season, I think that can be a delay. And Sarah, you probably can answer that one better.
Yeah, well, so the clarification is saying yes, more for changes in long-term rainfall.
Oh, okay.
So.
Yeah, so I would just say, you know, it's providing an extra incentive in terms of the culture around dam removal in the country and in Massachusetts.
Yeah, I mean, and just to add, you know, that when we do have these more intense rainfall events, you know, you are increasing the likelihood of these dams breaching, which certainly would increase the likelihood of a project happening, maybe even when you weren't expecting it to be the first project you tackled, like with Mill Pond. On the flip side, the increased amount of low water levels also kind of provides a little bit of an opportunity for it being easier to accomplish the project if you're managing to get that work done at the right time of year.
Right. Yeah, I guess the next question is also sort of on the similar lines. Given the expectation for increased precipitation with climate change, is there an acceleration or of processing for high hazard dam removal?
Right now, a lot of that kind of statewide view is being done by the Division of Ecological Restoration, and they only have the capacity to take on a certain number of what they deem as priority restoration projects. And they're working not only in dam removals, but also, as Sarah mentioned, in cranberry bog restorations and salt marsh restorations. So I think that it's really capacity limited right now in terms of the capacity of that department to help get things done.
Next question asks, are there increased insurance liabilities for dam owners and therefore incentives to remove the dams?
That's a good. So this is just sort of as I recall, but I think a lot of people or organizations that own dams, that perhaps that dam might not be included on their insurance policy. It's kind of, sometimes people don't know that they own dams. Sometimes organizations don't realize it. So that may kind of go under the radar. Certainly, if a dam were to breach and cause a problem downstream, I could definitely, there's a liability there for the dam owner. There's also just maintenance pressure on a dam owner. And dam owners will eventually get a letter from the Office of Dam Safety saying that they need to get their dam inspected. And once, there are flaws found in the dam, then the onus is on the owner to resolve that. And that just kind of brings up another point about dam removal that is often a misconception, which is people often will say, well, if the dam's in poor condition, why don't you just repair it? And to repair a dam to Office of Dam Safety standards now is extremely expensive, and to be honest, would create much more of an eyesore than the abutters would probably want to deal with, because it has to be tall and very concrete intensive in order to meet those regulations.
Yeah, and that's exactly the issue with what happened at the South Natick Dam, is that, now dam safety requires that any dam that has tree roots growing in it those trees need to be taken down. And something that the community really loves about the South Natick Dam is those beautiful trees. So that's exactly right.
One last question. Are there specific volunteer needs or what are ways for individuals to get involved, I guess, with these projects?
Can I answer that one?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so there's a couple different things. Certainly contributing as a citizen scientist to the monitoring that goes on around these dam removals, particularly if one of the aims is fish passage. Being able to document even just presence and absence of fish above and below a dam, and participating in fish counts is a great way to get involved in a project like that, and also help increase the stewardship for that project. And then the other thing is getting involved in supporting the project within your community. So showing up to Conservation Commission meetings when the project is, up for discussion, and, putting your voice out there saying, I think this project is a great idea. Because the more support a project has, I think the easier it manages to get through permitting, and also the less contention you end up with. when you hear those positive voices.
A couple more questions. When you remove the dam, how do you control the water course so that it doesn't flood downstream as it might when the dam is breached?
So when you do a dam removal, you do what's called a controlled drawdown. So most of these dams have, or many I should say, will have either boards in them that are controlling the water level, or they'll have what's called a low level outlet. So it's like a place where the water can go that's lower in the pond. And so you slowly drain it and you allow the water to come out slowly, but you also are allowing the bottom of the impoundment to consolidate and settle as well. So when you actually do finish the dam removal, it cuts a much better channel because that sort of ground is a little bit more solid. It's important to just clarify and point out too that because our dams are pretty much across the board are not used for flood control, they're what's called run-of-the-river dams, that the amount of water coming into that impoundment is the same amount of water coming over the dam. So they're not storing any additional flood water.
Mm-hmm. The last question says, do downstream communities typically know who owns the dams just above them?
That's a great question, and I think maybe that's a little bit related to this Eagle Dam project in Rentham that does affect downstream communities. No, I think not most of the time, unless there have been things like breaches and that's caused flooding. But that's another reason why us as watershed associations are really important, just to try to make those hydraulic connections and you know, make sure that the stakeholders know what's affecting them from downstream and upstream, and making sure that they can communicate and work together on these issues.
Well, that's all we have for questions. So I guess since we are almost at time, I'm going to wrap up here, and thank you both for an excellent presentation and Q&A session. Just for all the participants, know that we will be posting the recording for the session tomorrow, so you are able to access it and share it with friends and peers that might not have been able to attend today. And with that, thank you so much for taking the time this evening to join us, and we look forward to future conversations. Thank you all, and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.